Kia ora everyone. This is almost everything you'll need to know about the forearm posterior compartment. The posterior compartment of the forearm has 11 muscles in it, but they can helpfully be broken up into groups to help when learning them. And I like to break them up into 3 groups. The first group is 2 muscles that do not cross the wrist. The second group is 5 muscles that do cross the wrist but are relatively superficial and have their proximal attachments in or around the common extensor origin here, the lateral epicondyle, common extensor origin. And finally, the last 4 muscles, which consist of a deep group whose proximal attachments are the posterior surfaces of the radius and ulnar shafts here and the interosseous membrane in between them. So we'll start with the 2 muscles that do not cross the wrist. The first is brachioradialis, which we saw in relation to the cubital fossa. It's actually a more anterior muscle and is functionally a flexor, but it's considered in the posterior group because it's supplied by the radial nerve, which means at some point it was probably an extensor. Anyway, it arises proximally from high up here on the lateral supraepicondylar ridge, and most of its bulk is anterior, forming the lateral border of the cubital fossa, but some of it arches over here, and it's attached distally into the styloid process of the radius. It's a prominent muscle in the proximal forearm, especially when the forearm is semi-pronated. The other muscle from the posterior compartment that doesn't cross the wrist is supinator. It arises from the supinator crest and fossa here on the ulnar, and its fibers curl over the proximal shaft of the radius, and it also has a secondary head of attachment, more vertical fibers that descend from the humerus. So those are the 2 muscles that don't cross the wrist. The 5 muscles that cross the wrist in the superficial group are firstly extensor carpi radialis longus. This is the only one that does not arise from the common extensor origin, rather it's just above it here, again on the lateral supraepicondylar ridge. It's quite bulky and from the posterior view almost eclipses brachioradialis, and its tendon runs down to the base of the second metacarpal. So again, quite a bulky muscle. And the other 4 muscles from the superficial group do arise at least partially from the common extensor origin. The first of these is the sibling muscle, if you like, of extensor carpi radialis longus, and that's extensor carpi radialis brevis, and its attachment is the base of the third metacarpal. Next is the main extensor of the fingers, which is extensor digitorum, again from the common extensor origin, fairly broad muscle that separates into 4 tendons, 1 for each of the digits of the fingers, and they expand into the extensor apparatus or extensor mechanisms. A small offshoot of extensor digitorum for some reason is extensor digiti minimi, again from the common extensor origin, a small muscle that joins the extensor expansion of the 5th digit. This enables you to extend your little finger on its own, which is very useful, for example, when drinking tea. If you want to appear snobbish, one should drink one's tea in the style of this lady. Also, it's poor etiquette to cut your scone. See, you're not only learning anatomy here. Finally, in this group is extensor carpi ulnaris. It has a head of origin from the common extensor origin and also another head from the posterior border of the ulna here, which it shares with flexor carpi ulnaris via an aponeurosis, and it extends down to the base of the 5th metacarpal. So the 2nd, 3rd and 5th metacarpal bases have distal attachment sites for extensor muscles of the wrist. It's worth noting that extensor carpi radialis longus is longer because its proximal attachment is higher up than extensor carpi radialis brevis here rather than here. The distal extent of their tendons is roughly the same on adjacent metacarpals down here. I'll just go through the names of the muscles again because there's 5 of them. They got quite bunched up. So here, extensor carpi radialis longus. This is extensor carpi radialis brevis. This is extensor digitorum. Here, extensor digiti minimi. And finally, extensor carpi ulnaris. So the 5 muscles of the superficial group of wrist and finger extensors. That brings us to the third and final group, the deep group of muscles. The first of these, the most proximal and the largest, is abductor pollicis longus. It arises from here proximally, and its tendon runs radially and into the base of the first metacarpal. Next, on the ulnar side, is extensor pollicis longus. It arises from this sort of area, and it has a very characteristic tendon that projects towards the midline and then takes a sharp turn around the dorsal tubercle of the radius and extends all the way along the thumb to the base of the distal phalanx. In between these two is a smaller extensor pollicis brevis muscle. Its tendon tends to follow that of abductor pollicis longus, takes a radial course and inserts into the base of the proximal phalanx of the thumb. It's worth noting that these three tendons here, just beyond the styloid process of the radius, to the base of the metacarpal of the thumb, delineate the anatomical snuff box, an important anatomical location. And we'll talk about that in the next video, probably. Finally, we have extensor indicis, a small muscle, again on the ulnar side here, that projects to the extensor expansion of the index finger. So we see that with all these extensors for individual digits, we can abduct and extend the thumb and the index finger and the little finger. And if we do all of these together, then we get this symbol, which is apparently the American Sign Language symbol for I love you, because it combines the letters I, L, and Y. So that's really nice. Of course, it's not to be confused with this symbol, which is the devil's horns, and that means you're a mettler, which is cool. And that again is different from this symbol, which is the shaka symbol, which means that you're like a cool surfer dude. Hopefully not one of the surfers who's funding their endless summer by ripping off banks, though. Naughty. I'll just label these again because there's a few of them for revision. Abductor pollicis longus here, extensor pollicis longus, extensor pollicis brevis, and extensor indicis. If we add in the superficial group, extensors carpi radialis longus and brevis, extensor digitorum, extensor digiti minimi, and extensor carpi ulnaris, it's worth drawing in here flexor carpi ulnaris because it is more prominent posteriorly, and it does have this sheared origin with extensor carpi ulnaris along the posterior border of the ulna and also extending onto the olecranon here, and this combines with its proximal attachment at the common flexor origin, and the tendon moves more anteriorly, so these two heads combine. And we can illustrate the passage of the ulnar nerve between the two heads of flexor carpi ulnaris to regain its position in the anterior compartment. We can even draw in some of the other muscles we've seen, brachioradialis, triceps posteriorly from the arm, touch of biceps here. And by adding some fascia, particularly this band of fascia here, which is the extensor retinaculum, which binds the tendons down, and then the deep fascia of the arm and forearm, get an appreciation for the contours of the posterior forearm. In order to help memorize some of these myriad attachments, we could draw the metacarpal bases in cross-section here. They're appearing as chunky rectangles. So this will be the first of the thumb, second. We can draw in the attachments of the muscles that move the wrist. Extensor carpi radialis longus, extensor carpi radialis brevis, extensor carpi ulnaris, flexor carpi ulnaris, also attaching to the hook of the hamate and the pisiform bone more proximally than the metacarpal bases, and flexor carpi radialis here. We can even add in abductor pollicis longus here for completion. So I hope that helps. So we've just got time to look at some surface anatomy in an athlete. This is Manny Pacquiao again, showing us his brachioradialis here on the left, extensor carpi radialis longus. Here will be extensor carpi radialis brevis, extensor digitorum, and extensor digiti minimi. Here the two heads of extensor carpi ulnaris are combining. It got a bit shaggy. And we can also see flexor carpi ulnaris bulging seductively from the anterior compartment. These hodads here are Manny's faux hemers. Best advice, avoid. So that's almost everything you need to know about the forearm posterior compartment. As always, there's a juicy table in your book that hopefully agrees with everything I just said. You should also read the text. But apart from those dreary tasks, enjoy the rest of your day. Ka kite.